So, Jess, if you want to go to the next slide. So, just to give you a brief rundown of what we'll be talking about today, we're talking a little bit about the project background, and particularly some of the knowledge gaps. So what we know about the importance of farmer networks, where we're coming at this work from at NWF, as well as kind of where we thought there more information would be needed, both for us and for others as well. And then, like I said, Alita is going to spend some time going through our methods that we use to collect information about networks, including multiple rounds of surveys that we went through. And then I'm going to share some of the highlights and results. Again, given that there's more to this that's in our written report than we'll be able to go through today. Next slide, please. All right. So as I said, farmer networks and the role of kind of social norms and social approaches to conservation is kind of at the core of what NWF has been doing for the last decade plus. And this is really grounded in an understanding that farmers, are repeatedly shown to be one of the most important, trusted, valuable sources of information and social support for other farmers when it comes to not only conservation decision making, but a wide range of management and operational decisions. We have definitely noticed over the last few years sort of this growing momentum and conversation around the importance of farmer networks for supporting conservation efforts. So, and then, again, we've been using this basic approach through our Conservation Champions program for over a decade now. Again, really grounded in this idea that farmers are trusted sources of information and influence for farmers. And so we want to support farmer-led conservation outreach approaches, sort of taking that network-based approach. Next slide. So specifically with this project, we again, recognizing that research repeatedly demonstrates the importance of social influences of social farmer networks in supporting both adoption decisions and continued use of practices. This is something that comes up time and again in research on this. But there's still a lot that we don't know about networks. And specifically, as we started to think more about how we at NWF or other organizations like ours could better support networks, we kind of had to start with this basic idea or basic question of where are networks located? Where are networks? How many are there? What are they doing? What kinds of audiences or populations are they engaging with? And how do they do that kind of work? And then also, as we'll touch on it here a little bit later, where are the gaps? Where are the what kinds of resources or support or policies are needed to better support farmer networks if they are so central to supporting conservation decisions at the local scale. So with this approach, we use a mixed methods a research approach to basically inventory where farmer networks are within the Great Lakes states. And I'll mention that this work was supported by the Great Lakes Protection Fund. And their support in this was really invaluable throughout, in both helping us kind of design and identify what the right questions were, and then supporting our inventory methods. Next slide, please. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it along to Alita to start talking through some of the methods we used.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. So as we began this project, we knew from our experiences and the literature how important farmer networks are, as Adam was saying. But we also understood that a number of these networks do exist throughout the Great Lakes Basin, but there's a lot we didn't know. And so working to help illuminate these knowledge gaps drove our study and helped us build out the questions that we would ask in our surveys. So the big knowledge gaps that we saw were, first of all, how many networks exist? We knew that they were there in the Great Lakes Basin, but how many are there? Where are they located? And who participates in these networks? And another important knowledge gap is, what type of farmers do these networks engage? Are they focused on the innovative farmers who are already using these important soil health practices? Or are they reaching the more resistant middle and late adopter farmers? And lastly, we didn't know what practices these networks focus on and what support do they need. So we were wondering, do they focus on specific practices such as water quality or nutrient management? Are these networks growing? Are they shrinking? So in order to better support these networks, we also needed to understand their current needs. So do they need more access to information? Do they need more funding or additional training support? And so working to fill in these knowledge gaps will help us and other organizations better understand what segments of the farming population are currently being served by networks, and what are currently underserved and how we can best support them. Next slide. And so here is a map to help visualize our study area for the project. So our study area was these 8 Great Lakes states, which includes Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through a brief overview of our methods and a timeline for this project. So this slide provides a brief overview for you. And so our project started with an exploratory process. So we first began with connecting with other regional collaborators. So through individual conversations and group discussions, we identified projects that were complementary to ours with implications for Great Lakes conservation efforts that would allow for better understanding of farmer networks. And we connected with these people and their organizations, and this helped inform our research design and questions. So these included researchers at Purdue University, the Farmer Leadership Project led by the North Central Regional Water Center, and the REAMP Network, which focuses on advancing climate-smart agriculture policy in the Midwest. And then we also interviewed professionals from several additional organizations. So we spoke with people from the Nature Conservancy and Sand County Foundation, Michigan State University Extension, and a few others to also understand their perspectives of farmer networks and what they knew about them as well. And so after that, we moved on to working to identify farmer networks. So along with the information we'd gained from these interviews, we also conducted an internet-based search for networks across our Great Lakes states. So we began with looking up networks that we had identified in literature and that we had learned from our key informant interviews, and then did internet searches using a combination of key terms. So we combined terms such as farmer networks, farmer-led networks, sustainable agriculture networks, and we used these key search terms along with each state in the region. So this helped us come up with as many networks as we possibly could find. And we were able to identify additional ones from looking at who the networks partnershiped with and if they had any sponsored. And it was important to note during background research where these connections were, because they led to finding additional networks as well. And collectively, through all of these efforts, we were able to identify 123 unique networks and supporting organizations of varying size. So from there, we developed our conservation organization survey. So using our information from our conversations and our key informant interviews, we identified key characteristics of networks that we wanted to learn about, and we've developed a short survey to collect this. And we sent this out to a list of conservation organizations across the region. And we administered that through Qualtrics in 3 different rounds to 728 individuals or organizations. And from there, we learned after our original survey efforts, we realized there was even more questions that we still didn't have answered about the goals and needs of farmer networks. So this is where our farmer network survey came in. So we developed an additional survey that was administered to 133 networks that we found through our desk research and our first survey. And I'm going to go through more detail in the following slides about each of these surveys and our process for them. Next slide. Thank you. So our first survey we conducted, we are calling the Conservation Organization Survey. So in autumn of 2022, we developed a brief survey based on our key informant interviews and our conversations. And this survey had 9 questions, and these questions addressed the importance of networks and conservation adoption, the network names, how long they've existed, where they're area focused, and other general questions about their characteristics. And to send out this survey, we compiled a comprehensive contact list of conservation organizations across all the Great Lakes states. And our contact list included individuals from each state, from NRCS, conservation districts, University Extension Services, the Department of Agriculture, as well as NGO and other agricultural organizations. Next slide. Thank you. And so we conducted this first survey in 3 different rounds through Qualtrics. So we started with a small sample of state level organizations to pilot our survey approach, and then followed by additional state level organizations, and finally local level organizations, which included the hundreds of conservation districts in the region. So in total, we surveyed 728 individual organizations, and we received 131 responses for an overall response rate of 18%. We had 68 surveys that were completed, 63 were partially completed, but we analyzed all response data, including those from the incomplete surveys. Next slide, please. And so following our first survey, we identified several other questions about the structure, goals, and needs of networks in the Great Lakes states. And to address these questions, we wanted to survey the networks again and asking them, keeping in mind our original knowledge gaps that we wanted to address. So we surveyed the 133 networks we identified through our desk research and first survey. So we developed a short survey with 10 questions and administered this to network contacts in the March 2023. We were able to find contact information for 150 networks, and we received 25 completed responses. So that gave us a 22% response rate. And some example of questions on this survey included what farmer network they were involved in, what year was the group started, what geographic scale does this network work at, such as county, watershed, regional, or statewide, and what types of audiences or populations does this network work to impact, along with a few other questions as well. And next slide. So through all of our efforts, our interviews, our background research, and surveys, we identified 210 farmer networks in total. These range widely in form and scope, and there's a significant variation in the types of networks that we identified through our survey. So a number that we identified were not what we might have defined as farmer-centered conservation networks, but we intentionally left this definition of networks broad so we could cast a larger net due to the inherent difficulties in defining networks. Most don't fit into a clear box, and they have varying forms and structures, so we want to collect as many as we could. But some examples of networks that we identified that may not center conservation as a key aspect included groups like Young Farmers Coalition and Farm Bureau. We also had some respondents who included general social networks or events in their responses as well. And so with the understanding that farmer networks are inherently difficult to define, we needed to categorize survey responses. So based on our previous conversations and our own experiences, we categorized the over 200 networks we found into these 4 categories. So our farmer-centered networks, and there was 133 that we developed, that we found, as well as public agencies supporting farmer conservation through programs or policies. There was 31 that we found, and some examples of those included the Pennsylvania Association of Conservation Districts, or NRCS. We also had a category of private organizations that support farmer conservation efforts, 38 of them, and some examples included New York Agricultural Land Trust or the Ohio Farm Bureau. And then finally, we had an other category. So any events or general social networks that were identified fell into this category. There's 8 of those, and some examples included the Northern Indiana Grazing Conference or defined communities, including Amish and Mennonite farmers. And now I'll pass it back to Adam to go over more details about our results.
Yeah, thank you, Alita. I wanted to just kind of reiterate some of what Alita was just saying, because I think when we started this project, we recognized that there's diversity in the types and structure of networks, but as we got into it, we really were kind of overwhelmed by the complexity of what exists, and the idea that there really is no 1 or even 2 or 4 formats of farmer networks that exist. There are many, many more than that. There, in many ways, there are no 2 networks that are exactly the same. And so that's some of what you'll see throughout the insights that we're going to share today. But that created a lot of challenges in terms of defining what do we mean by networks, because there are multiple types of networks we could talk about. And so just to reiterate what Alita was saying, that this is has been a challenging process, but I think that we've kind of come up with some definitional boundaries around this that might be helpful for others going forward, particularly in distinguishing between farmer-centered networks as a form of social organization designed to focus on supporting conservation decisions that work in partnership with a lot of other types of organizations and agencies and groups. And so that's just something to keep in mind throughout this, is that we likely did not identify everything that that one could classify as a farmer-centered network in the region, and there are certainly other kinds of organizations or networks or groups that focus on a broader set of outcomes or goals that might include conservation, but that weren't exclusively focused or primarily focused on conservation. And so when we think about the kinds of groups that we're looking at or talking about today, I just wanted to kind of make that clear. So let's jump into some of the insights here. Next slide. All right, so the first question is, where are networks located? As we see, they are kind of spread throughout the Great Lakes states, with one kind of clear outlier here. So as we got into this, we found that Wisconsin had by far the largest number of identifiable farmer networks, and that is simply due to the presence of a statewide program that specifically supports farmer-led or producer-led watershed groups. So this is a state program that offers grant funding to groups and organizations led by farmers to focus on improving water quality outcomes through use of soil health practices, regenerative grazing, or other kinds of conservation practices. I think there are some interesting ramifications of this. The first is simply that the presence of this state program and resources to support networks has just resulted in a lot of more formal networks with names and organizations and leaders that are easily identifiable. On the other end of the sort of formality range, there are certainly groups that one might think of as a farmer network, but that are much more loosely or informally organized, that don't say have an organizational name, or they're certainly not like a 501c3 type organization. And those are much more difficult to identify, but likely exist throughout this region or throughout other regions. So I think the takeaway here is that Wisconsin's formalized program certainly helps to support farmer networks and also makes them more easy to identify. There are some other insights around sort of geographical differences between states that we'll get into here in a few minutes, because we certainly did see some kind of geographic trends. Next slide, please. All right, so again, on the theme of variation, farmer networks cover a wide range of size and membership structures. I would say that most of the networks that we identified are not, kind of formal membership-based organizations. They might have a kind of core group of farmer leaders or farmers who are involved in a leadership or coordinating role, but that most are not kind of a dues-paying type organization. Networks cover a wide range of geographies, and we just categorize these in kind of 3 scales, but I think there's probably a lot of variation in between these as well. So the majority of networks, over half, really are focused on kind of local scale, local watershed, a single county, multiple counties within a state. They are small, they are locally focused organizations. About a quarter of the networks we identified have less than 25 kind of active participants or farmer members. There are, on the other hand, are a number of organizations that focus on a broad scale, so statewide or regional or multi-state networks. And these are again, bigger, broader organizations. They tend to be larger in terms of the number of participants. On the other end, a quarter of the networks we identified have more than 100 active participants or members, and that's again particularly for those larger those networks with larger geographic scopes. There was a distribution in terms of how long these networks have existed. Some were brand new, less than a year old. Some were 25 or more years old. So if we look at figure 5 here, just kind of showing the geographic distribution of networks that are less than 5 years old versus networks that are older than 10 years, we do see some geographic trends with the eastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, tending to have older networks. And there's another implication there that we'll get into here in a minute. as opposed to maybe some of the Western states in the region that have that skew a little bit younger in terms of network age. One of the things we did also see is that nearly all networks that we identified are either maintaining in size or growing. And again, particularly for those younger networks, they're in a growth phase as they are getting established and up and running. Next slide, please. One of the other things I think that has been really informative about what we've learned through this work is the types of leadership structures that exist. And you'll notice that throughout this, we've tended to use the term farmer-centered network as opposed to farmer-led network. And that is an outgrowth of what we've identified, and maybe what our experience had told us before, is that some of these organizations are created by, led by exclusively farmers, but a number are not. There are, about 2/3 of networks are some combination of either farmers and other organizations or agencies that are helping to facilitate or lead these networks. And some are about 1/3 or 1/4 are not led by farmers. Farmers are sort of the member targets of outreach or engagement efforts, but farmers aren't necessarily directly involved in the leadership of those organizations, right? So again, there's a lot of diversity out there in terms of how these organizations are structured. But one of the big takeaways is that a number of organizations or different kinds of organizations or agencies are involved in these, right? So a lot of nonprofits are helping to lead or support farmer-centered networks. Government agencies are also involved. And likewise, networks receive funding from a variety of sources, and often multiple sources. So, state and government or local government funding, federal government funding, particularly through grants administered by federal agencies are quite common, as well as support from non-governmental organizations. Direct fundraising and foundations are less often used and are often used when organizations are relying on direct fundraising or foundations. That's often in combination with existing funding from agencies or NGOs. Next slide, please. Okay, so when thinking about some of the kind of geographic differences and distributions, I think this slide and the next slide are kind of getting into some of the specifics around why we might see some differences in age or structure or size between states. So again, when we look at this map shows the percentage of networks in each state that are primarily farmer-led. And again, we see Wisconsin really being the standout here. And again, I'll reference the existing state-level program that directly supports farmer-led network-based approaches. And then there's some difference between the other states, but generally, again, it's roughly 1/3 to maybe half of networks in each state that are led by farmers. Again, I will attribute the Wisconsin state program in providing the resources to help support farmer conservation or farmer-led conservation or farmer leadership in those networks. Because again, certainly I don't want to imply that farmers aren't heavily involved in networks, even where they aren't the primary leadership. But again, farmers are full-time farmers, right? Or often will have, off-farm job responsibilities as well. And so being able to provide, the time and energy to be leaders in organizations requires a level of resources and support that, the Wisconsin program is perhaps able to provide that isn't maybe available in some other states. I will also note that New York and Pennsylvania were sort of the standouts in terms of networks that were supported by other organizations. So, and then if you think back to the longevity figure, it's also notable that those two states, New York and Pennsylvania, tended to have the older networks compared to other states in the region, which there's likely something going on there we weren't fully able to explore in this study, but that perhaps, agencies, state agencies, federal agencies in those states were able to invest in networks, a decade or more ago, leading to both networks that are not primarily farmer-led and that are also older. Next slide, please. All right. So one of the things we were very interested in learning more about is what do networks do? What kinds of activities are they engaged in, and who are they trying to reach through their efforts? So again, there's a wide range of different focuses that networks have. Soil health was definitely the most predominant kind of issue or topic that was focused on, followed by water quality and rotational grazing. So as we asked this question, we allowed respondents to indicate among a variety of categories, including some that aren't included here in this slide. And these were just the ones that had responses. So I think one of the takeaways here is that these networks tend to focus on what I might think of as like slightly broader outcomes as opposed to individual practices. So as you see here, I mean, there were some organizations that focus very specifically on practices like cover. All right. Of course, Zoom dropped on me in the middle. So to networks use a wide range of activities, field days being the most predominant. So field days, and again, in our experience with our Conservation Champions program, farmers not only like to learn from other farmers, but they like to learn in a specific context, right? They like to see things in action. They like to see soil health practices or practices that can improve water quality in action. More kind of general trainings or conservation planning were also used. There were a number of networks that included like on-farm research took a sort of research network approach, as well as demonstrations and trainings, and those were often specifically around equipment or specific kind of applications. Next slide, please. Okay. This is just digging into this a little bit more, sort of looking at state to state differences, because again, states have different, the networks in different states tended to have slightly different focuses. Again, as you'll see in this graphic, soil health tended to be the most predominant focus in each state, but there was some variation from place to place. New York and Michigan stood out as having more focus on water quality, and again, noting that New York, again on sort of the edge of the Great Lakes region, also has more agency-led organization networks and longer, more established networks that are specifically focused on water quality outcomes. One other interesting note is that Indiana tended to have the networks in Indiana tended to be larger statewide organizations or groups focused on a broader set of outcomes. So again, these tended to be larger, more established, had maybe more capacity to deliver programming or focus on not just, say, soil health, but also things like nutrient management or rotational grazing. Notably here, we were exploring the approaches of kind of improved nutrient management or integrated pest management as perhaps salient conservation issues, but those tended to be less a focus of farmer-led conservation. Next slide, please. And this is, again, just the same graphic, perhaps a slightly closer look here with, again, I think the big takeaway is that cover crops and soil health tended to be the largest focus of farmer networks, but not the exclusive focus. Next slide. All right, so who are farmer networks engaging? So we were particularly interested in looking at the kinds of outreach or promotional efforts that networks were engaging in, and particularly which audiences they were trying to reach. So at NWF, one of the primary kind of frameworks that we use is trying to understand differences between early adopters, so farmers who are now or have been using conservation practices for some time, as opposed to non-adopters, or what we sometimes refer to as middle adopters. So farmers who are maybe more skeptical or reluctant for a number of reasons to use soil health or regenerative practices. As we found in our research here, early adopters and kind of conservation using farmers were the primary both membership and target of or intended audience for network activities. So I might start to think of some of these networks as more of those kind of early adopter innovator networks. And again, thinking back to the kinds of activities that they use, so both demonstrations as well as those kinds of research networks or kind of technical assistance networks. That said, a large number of networks also focus on middle adopters, and I'll note too that these aren't mutually exclusive categories, right? We were interested in what kinds of audiences networks engaged, and found that most networks engaged at least two audiences, if not a number of the above. So early adopters and middle adopters tended to be the most common kind of primary audiences for networks. But some networks were also more kind of externally focused, on bringing together resource professionals or conservation organizations with farmers, often in a collaborative way. Some networks were focused as well on reaching out to policymakers, had perhaps policy goals as well, being sort of serving a sort of advocacy role as well. And then advisors and retailers. And this was less common, but it was interesting to note that where networks were engaging with private sector companies or retail advisors. And again, in terms of the strategies used in outreach, so how to reach those sort of middle adopters or those other audiences, again, the methods used there were quite similar. In our second survey, when we surveyed the networks themselves, almost all networks who responded basically had all of the above, right? So when we asked, like, what are your primary or preferred forms of engagement, they're doing everything they can to get the word out, to engage the broadest set of audiences they can. Next slide, please. Defining network success. So we were curious about kind of what, we asked about what goals or primary resource concerns networks were focused on, but we also wanted to understand how they evaluate their own success. So what are those sort of measures or indicators that they are looking to measure their success? So we found that, again, networks rely on a number of different metrics. And that most have more than one priority outcome, right? So again, networks are trying to be broad and focused not on individual practices necessarily, but on a broad set of outcomes. And those include, holding local demonstrations, right? So being that sort of indicator of local success. There was a lot of overlap there with networks that had that as their primary focus, and organizations that are networks that were focused on middle adopters. So again, those early adopters being a powerful demonstration for their non-adopting neighbors and peers of the power of an ability to implement conservation practices locally. Increased knowledge of conservation systems was also a major focus, as well as development of new practices and methods or approaches to conservation. Again, emphasizing perhaps that role of those innovator networks, right? Bringing together innovative and early adopter farmers to help continue to kind of push and develop approaches locally. Interestingly, again, focusing on outcomes was a focus, but maybe less so than some of those other indicators, but improved local conditions. Also, interestingly, improved connections, right? That sort of community building or social approach was also recognized by many networks as an important outcome in and of itself. So again, kind of mirroring that need to not only focus on kind of the conservation or environmental aspects of sustainability, but also on the social aspects of sustainability. And then less so, but again, used by a number of networks was practice adoption as one indicator, as well as access to new technology or equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, one of our particular interests is where could an organization like NWF or other organizations help to support farmer networks? And to know that, we need to have a better idea of what areas of support do farmer networks primarily need. Not surprisingly, financial resources jump out as the largest area of need. Certainly, I think for any of us in the conservation space, the access to financial resources is always going to be, to some extent, a limiter. One of the things that jumped out that I think is also interesting is the idea of funding flexibility. So it's not just access to financial resources, but the ability to use that for the right kinds of activities that networks want to be engaging in. One of the things that we heard through our exploratory conversations and our kind of initial work, and then our own experience in farmer-led conservation outreach, is that sometimes funding is available for certain kinds of activities that might include, holding a field day, but it maybe doesn't supply the right kinds of resources for those more informal networking opportunities that may be so important in sustaining those social connections. Also, there were other areas of support that farmer networks needed, including access to technical resources, but also outreach and communications training and leadership training, right? So that ability to help support effective peer-to-peer interaction and peer-to-peer learning that maybe farmers or the organizations that are supporting them don't always have access to. And so those are areas to also be considering. And then finally, equipment, right? Access to maybe another form of resource alongside financial resources that might be helpful for allowing farmer networks to be as effective as they can be. And then finally, networks actively collaborate. We asked networks to identify who their primary collaborators are. I gave people up to 5 options within the survey framework, and pretty much every respondent used all 5. Some entered additional ones in the open-end comment boxes. So networks are highly networked among each other. I think was the big takeaway here, is that networks are often collaborating with other farmer networks, with government agencies, with NGOs that are engaged in conservation efforts, with universities, and with farm industry organizations. So, and it was often a combination of those. So these are not kind of siloed or isolated networks. But again, one of the things that we definitely learned through this process is that networks feel like they could be even better networked, and that they may not have all of the right connections that they feel that they could benefit from. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, now we've touched on some of the highlights here. I want to take a moment to just kind of talk about some of the future work, because I think we learned a lot through this process, but there's still a lot more work to be done, both in terms of additional questions that we have about how networks are structured, how they function, and what kinds of outcomes they're achieving, and then some policy and kind of practice concepts as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, some of the lingering kind of research questions that I have, after we've completed this work, I want to know more about this role of social norms and information, right? So we saw that in terms of the outcomes or metrics that farmer networks are relying on, it's a combination both of increased knowledge, so that role of technical information, those local demonstrations, but also improved social connections and networks, social networks locally. And I'm curious about how that works in practice, and what the role of social developing positive social norms and expanding those social norms to non-adopting farmers. I think there's some interesting questions there. We asked questions about funding needs, where farmers or where networks are receiving funding from, where they could use more, or that they could use more funding. And I think we have more questions about how those funding streams are typically structured, and where how tweaks might need to be made to those to better support networks. And then finally, impacts, right? Because again, farmer networks exist for a reason, whether it's to achieve water quality outcomes, or expand use of soil health practices, or build local social connections. but I definitely get the sense that that networks likely need more support in terms of evaluating their own outcomes, and being able to better strategize and identify what specific outcomes they are focused on. And certainly we want to be able to identify or understand how network activities are linked to those ultimate conservation or environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. In terms of policy, again, one of the big takeaways from this is the presence of Wisconsin's producer-led conservation program or water quality program that's clearly resulted in more formalized networks across the state. And I think this could be a useful case study in terms of understanding how, the role that the state agency plays in supporting those local groups, and understanding better what their success has been, what their impact has been, and exploring whether that's a model that could be applied to other states. Likewise, are there other successful programs? I mean, certainly we've run across programs that exist, kind of across the region in different states that help support public-private partnerships, different forms of organization or agency-led farmer programs. And then, we, again, in Wisconsin, there's a new program focused specifically on expanding farmer leadership and providing training for farmer leaders. So I think there's some interesting questions around how policies could better support those aspects of farmer networks. Next slide. And then again, in practice. So we know that there are a number of organizations that play a role in helping to support or directly facilitate these networks. And there's more question that I have about what that looks like in practice. What are those different kind of formats or structures? What kinds of approaches to providing financial resources or outreach training has been the most successful at achieving both the direct goals of farmer networks as well as the broader kind of conservation or social goals that those networks have? What is the role of facilitation and leadership in allowing those networks to not only grow but also thrive over a long period of time? And then finally, how to support farmer networks in terms of evaluation and monitoring of their progress and of the outcomes they're achieving. Next slide, please. So that's those are the highlights. And again, we thank you certainly for joining us today. And again, want to acknowledge the support of Great Lakes Protection Fund in this work. More information and resources about our programming at NWF can be found on our website, which is growingoutreach.nwf.org. And then lastly, actually, Jess, if I could have you stop sharing, I'm going to show folks where you can access our report. So there it is. So if you go to that link, the growingoutreach.nwf.org page, you'll see resources that we have about our existing programs, our outreach toolkit. And then over on this side, so under resources and research, if you click on this, it shows you some of what we've been working on, and at the top of the page is a little bit of a background about our report, and then you can access the full thing right here. So it's a 16-page PDF. It can be downloaded, and please do feel free to access that and share it with folks who you think might be interested. And with that, we'd like to, open it up to some Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes left. I see a few questions here for those.
Yeah, so I answered a few questions already in the chat, and then there's a couple more that maybe we could answer live. Well.
Yeah, so let me handle it. So why was Canada not included in this study? And we definitely we thought long and hard about whether to do that, and it was simply a capacity issue, that given the time constraints that we had with this study, we thought it was a little outside of the scope of what we could do, given that it was also it's a different governmental context and organizational context. There were perhaps just too many questions that we would have in kind of delving into that. but I do want to recognize that there's been a lot of work that's been done, particularly in Ontario, in terms of supporting farmer-led networks and conservation. So I think that would, we could put that kind of in the lingering research questions about how farmer networks have been supported in a different context that could be, I think, really invaluable for understanding the U.S. context. All right. Yeah, so there's a question. So are middle adopters synonymous with non-adopters? And that is a very good question. And I think the answer is no. They're not. But I think in practice, we often tend to use the terms interchangeably. So typically when we talk about middle adopters, we're talking about the roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of producers. And for those who are familiar with the diffusion of innovations theory, it is sort of a bell curve shape that demonstrates or represents the way in which new technology or practice moves through a population. And so those middle adopters are kind of the middle meaty part of that bell curve. When we look at adoption rates of many of the kind of key conservation practices or approaches we're looking at, whether it's regenerative grazing systems or cover crops, often we're still in the like 5 to 10% adoption rate, which would indicate we're kind of still in the early adopter phase and maybe haven't moved to the middle adopters. But there are other areas, if we look at areas across the Great Lakes region where there's been quite a lot of adoption of, say, no-till as an example, if you're at 50 or 60% adoption rates of that practice, then you're definitely into that middle adopter group. And so in that context, middle adopters and non-adopters are not synonymous. So that's a really good distinction to make, that it kind of depends on the specific context. All right. And then, yeah, a good question about networks that are out there that weren't identified because they don't have a formal structure or administrative support. Is this an area of support that NWF thinks would be helpful to increase farmer effectiveness or network effectiveness? Yeah, again, this is a great question. And this is, I think, I suspect that the networks that we didn't identify or were able to identify in this work probably are more in that informal, again, lack of structure, administrative support realm. So, more of those like, local groups of farmers that get together regularly, maybe with some support from a local conservation group or organization, agency or organization, but may not have a formal name or kind of they're more loosely structured. And so those are very difficult to identify. It may be that those types of informal kind of local social groups are incredibly supportive as well in achieving conservation goals or outcomes. So I wouldn't necessarily want to say that those groups are less effective because they don't have that administrative support, but it's possible. I think that's a big lingering question here, is how does that kind of formality spectrum, those like highly informal to highly formal organizations and everything in between, is what are their goals and can they achieve them given the resources or structure they have? Or put a different way, could additional administrative support, facilitation, resources help to make those networks more effective in their goals?
And I'll just quickly add to that kind of a more informal networks that may exist, or maybe Facebook groups is a big one that sometimes showed up, but sometimes didn't. So there could be ones out there as well that maybe don't have formal names that we recognize that came up during research, but they still exist to help each other and chatting that way as another thing that we may have not caught in our inventory.
All right, and then there's another good question. So did we observe any differences in how farmers engaged with or were supported by farmer networks by demographics? So, for example, did networks have more representation of beginning farmers, more established farmers, farmers of color, et cetera? Yeah, again, this is a great question, and there is some more detail in our report about this. We did ask about sort of the not exclusively the demographics, but we included it as kind of focus or of membership, if these organizations or networks focused on or included beginning farmers, new farmers, women farmers, farmers of color. And there was certainly, again, sort of a all of the above type feel in many of the responses, but maybe less focus on some of those kind of what we might think of as traditionally underserved audiences in kind of a Midwestern agricultural context. And again, one of the things that we also ran into in sort of the definitional phase is that we were able to identify a number of networks that specifically focused on farmers of color or women farmers or beginning farmers that had some conservation focus, but that was not their primary focus. And so I think there's also an opportunity, again, to maybe think about how networks network with themselves or connect with each other, right? So if you have networks that are focused on helping to support, say, beginning farmers that don't have programming primarily focused on, say, soil health, is there a way for those organizations or networks to collaborate or partner with organizations that do focus on that soil health piece to help accomplish both goals? Because again, I think when we think broadly about the role of conservation, it's beneficial not only in being able to advance use of practices that might improve wildlife habitat or improve water quality, but that also have demonstrable impacts on farm resilience, on farm sustainability more broadly, and ultimately on the bottom line that that farmers have. So those are important things to be considering as well, is maybe not just putting conservation focus in a box, but helping to build connections broadly. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Aside from Wisconsin's networks, did you find any particular trends in what catalyzed the formation of the groups? You suggested there might have been key moments or policy windows that occurred in each state. Great question. And again, that is something that is still lingering that we weren't able to capture in this study. I kind of hinted at some maybe hypotheses that I have in terms of, particularly if we think about those eastern states, New York and Pennsylvania, and maybe it seems to me that perhaps there was a moment where state agencies identified the importance of engaging farmer networks or building farmer networks to achieve, say, water quality outcomes. But I don't know the history of that well enough to be able to speak to that. But I think there's a really interesting question about the role of those sort of maybe focusing events or policy opportunities that have been utilized at various points in time across the region. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great question about how outcomes are being measured by these organizations. So especially social outcomes, which are sometimes challenged to conceptualize. So the short answer is we didn't get a lot of insight into specifically how networks are measuring their outcomes. We asked them what metrics or outcomes they were focused on, but did not get a lot of at least quantitative insight in terms of how farmer or networks are actually measuring those. Again, through more qualitative approaches, I definitely gathered that most are not doing a very rigorous job, I would say, of measuring particularly those longer term outcomes, those social outcomes, the changes in water quality. Again, for any of us who work in programming or evaluation spaces, these are incredibly challenging connections to build. What is the result of a particular field day or even outreach program over the course of a year or two on water quality outcomes? So often the best I think networks or organizations are able to measure is maybe what is the kind of direct practice outcomes. So again, noting maybe where there's a little bit of a disconnect between networks recognizing they need to focus on broad outcomes, but it's easier to measure the more short-term outcomes or outputs of network activity. So I think there's both more work that needs to be done to understand exactly what metrics networks are able to collect, and then what resources or training or support might be needed to help them in their evaluation and monitoring efforts to be able to connect with those longer term outcomes. All right. Well, we are right about the end of the hour. So again, I want to express appreciation to everybody who joined us today. Again, appreciate the support of Great Lakes Protection Fund in this in this work, and also acknowledge the participation of folks who took the time to participate in our survey. So certainly, if anybody on the webinar today was part of that, we really appreciate your efforts there. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have additional questions or thoughts about our report, and we definitely hope to continue work in this kind of farmer network space going forward. So thanks to everyone.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining us, and we will post the recording as well on our website along with our report there. So thank you for your great questions and your engagement.